So, the year is 44 BC. You're 18 years old, and you're training to go on a military expedition with your great uncle in Illyrium, which is modern-day Albania, right across from Italy. And you're going about your business, and you receive a letter from your parents saying that your great uncle, Julius Caesar, has just been assassinated by a group of senators. And they urge you to stay put because he has named you as his heir and successor. And you now have a decision to make. Do you sail across the Adriatic, land in Italy, muster the troops, and go avenge your great uncle? Or do you stay put and play it safe and wait for this to pass and live a nice, long, happy, but unillustrious life? Ultimately, you decide to set sail, and you cross the Adriatic, and at that point, the die has been cast. This is your Rubicon.
You're listening to Manipulation Games, Psychology, and Marketing Podcast with your hosts, Gene and Darren.
Aha! Welcome to Manipulation Games, Psychology, and Marketing Podcast. I'm Darren with our marketing genius, Gene.
Hi.
And we have a special guest, a returning guest, Dr. Ian Silva. He has a PhD in the classics from Princeton. Welcome back.
Great to be here.
Well, that was a great intro. So I guess if you haven't gotten hints already, we're going to talk about Roman history again.
Yep.
And in particular, Augustus.
Yeah.
The great man.
Great man.
And I think the reason why we were kind of like talking about history is because I think the best way to learn, right, from the mistakes of the past or how to formulate new ideas is actually just to learn about the history itself. Yeah. And a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of manipulation games, the themes, manipulation of the masses, right? The Romans were experts at this through rhetoric. And so now we want to talk about Augustus and his masterful kind of game plan. I don't know what it is, PR campaign.
I don't know.
We could call it a PR campaign.
Yeah.
I think that's a safe analogy.
So he was a master of PR.
He really was. And you know, he had also a smart sort of team surrounding him that, you know, guys like Maecenas, his sort of minister of culture. I don't know what we would call him, but you know, he had Maecenas, he had Agrippa, who was his military genius. So he himself obviously had a lot of brilliant qualities, but he also had a lot of good people around him.
So today we're going to cover 4 kind of main themes, correct?
Yeah.
So originally we're going to start off just talking about the rise to power of this 18-year-old kid who's thrust into this moment in history.
Right, and sort of what the dynamics were in this moment of history into which he was dramatically thrust, as I so eloquently sort of illustrated at the beginning of this podcast.
Right, and then we're going to talk about how I guess he used the poets and images that were created during his time to essentially go from being this kind of unassuming little kid to, in the minds of other people, becoming a god.
Right.
And so that's a crazy manipulation, if you think about it, to go from essentially a little bit of a nobody to, by the end, having an entire empire believe you are divine.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And the fact that he was just 18.
Yeah. I mean, he was in the eyes of Romans, you know, he was a man at that point, but, you know, he was a boy. He was.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm kind of curious to think about is like how much of the story as we know it emphasizes how badass he is, and how much was he actually not badass?
Yeah,
how much of are we actually the victims of this PR battle that he kind of put into place.
That's a good point.
Where, because
Yeah.
history is written by the victors.
100%. And the losers in this, like Mark Antony, he comes off very poorly
Oh
in
yeah.
this story, because he's sort of maligned not only by Augustus, but Cicero lends the full weight of his brilliant oratory against Mark Antony in these speeches called the Philippics. He just rips him apart. And so a lot of that is responsible for how we think of Mark Antony now.
Okay.
So
let's do this.
Yeah.
The rise of Augustus.
yes.
So his uncle
Great
gets
uncle.
assassinated. His
Great
great
uncle.
uncle gets assassinated, which was kind of the end of the story of the kind of the last podcast,
Yes.
where he made himself a dictator, got stabbed like 1 million times,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And now Augustus received this letter,
Right.
and his parents are telling him, "Don't come back to Rome, stay put."
Yeah.
But he decides to do otherwise.
He does otherwise. Yeah, it's an amazing story which the ancient historians put out. You get it in Suetonius, Appian, Dio. And yeah, so basically he's an 18-year-old and he is thrust into this situation where back in Rome, Caesar's been assassinated. At this point, he's Gaius Octavius, that's his name. But once he gets word of the adoption, he sort of adopts Caesar's name. We'll get into that a little bit later. So he has this new persona, but he doesn't have any legitimate political power, right? He's just a citizen who happens to be now the son of the most famous Roman of them all. So he has to go back to Rome where two sort of factions are waiting for him. There's Mark Antony, who was Caesar's lieutenant throughout most of his political career. He sees himself as Caesar's sort of legitimate inheritor, even though he's not really named in the will. I think he gets a pittance of whatever fortune Caesar had. So it's kind of a real slap in the face to Mark Antony. Nevertheless, Mark Antony at this point does have political power. He does have legions that see him as a sort of loyal Caesarian. So he's sitting pretty in this situation. You also have the Roman senators who have murdered Caesar. They're still hanging about. And if not in Rome proper, then they're within striking distance. And these guys are also trying to wedge their way back into the system.
They murdered Caesar. Did they have a plan after? What happens afterwards?
This is why political assassinations are ill-advised. Because even with the best of plans, you can never account for all the factors. They had no plan, right? So Mark Antony very quickly establishes himself in Rome and is sort of shoring up the Caesarian faction, but he's looking to appease, right?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want more years of civil war. He just wants things to sort of simmer down, ideally with himself, firmly in power, and the senators will come to heel, right? That's his dream plan. Octavius messes up the game theory, right, by coming back to Rome, because now you have sort of two Caesarians when before you had just one, and this little upstart boy is extremely charismatic, and he's very good at playing up opportunities and manipulating situations to his favor.
So what was the first thing you did when you arrived in Rome?
So this gets into one of his kind of initial PR victories over both factions, because, as I said, Antony is kind of wanting to play nice with these people who have murdered his boss. So when Octavius comes to town, he starts garnering support. In Caesar's will, he not only received all this money, but he also received political sort of responsibilities. So he was supposed to dole out money to the people of Rome, sort of be their benefactors, and this also makes him very popular. So he goes about doing that. The veterans love him because he's Caesar's heir, his rightful heir, named in the will. So he has a lot of support, but he doesn't have power. So he's looking to sort of shore up whatever he can
So
garner. So there's this situation where before Caesar had been assassinated, he had been, this is when Caesar's the dictator. So he's awarded this sort of golden throne that's basically to be put on display at public festivals and games and things like that. This is part of what made Caesar kind of a king, and that's what led to his assassination. So Octavius goes full in on this, and at these games that happened early on in April that were put on, I think, by Brutus, he's like, hey, wait a minute, we should set up Caesar's golden throne.
so Brutus was one of the assassins, right?
Yeah. So he's like, we should set up this golden throne at the games in memory of Caesar, because that's what, the people want. And the sort of civic person in charge shuts him down. Antony supports this move, so they shut down the golden throne idea. So, all right, no golden throne. There's a game that happens a few months later, and again, Octavius is like, hey, what about this throne? We should put it up so that Caesar can be remembered. And the people are like, yeah, let's put up the throne.
So the people want the throne.
The people want the throne because
but the equivalent of Congress doesn't want the throne.
Congress doesn't want it. The people love Caesar because Caesar, again, has given them money. He's given them festivals. He's given them games. He's built, monuments. He's adorned the city. They love this guy. So Octavius knows what he's doing by inserting this issue. But again, the throne gets shut down once more with Antony's support. So Antony at this point is kind of pissing off the people. Finally, Octavius himself puts on a massive series of games called the Ludi Victoriae Caesaris, the games of Caesar's victory. And this is sort of in compensation for games that Caesar himself would have put on to celebrate all his massive victories militarily. Again, at this game, Octavius tries to set up this throne. But again, he doesn't have legitimate political power. Antony does. Antony shuts it down. So this throne at this point has become this sort of thing that by its mere absence is causing a sensation. And what Octavius does at this point is he starts minting coins, and he starts producing these little glass things that you could decorate with images and distribute. They're very cheap, and you could just print thousands of them and send them out to the people. And what he puts on these is an image of his own head and Caesar's throne, and he just keeps this idea going in the populace. So Antony at this point has lost all face with the people who support Caesar. He's come off very poorly. But then, and this is where the story of Octavius Augustus is really interesting, because there's a lot of luck that happens in his favor. And he kind of recognizes this, and he plays this up in representations of himself, because at this point, this is 44 BC, as the games are happening. This is sort of a succession of days that these games happen. As these games are happening, a comet appears. We don't know which comet it was. It wasn't Halley's, but it was a comet that appears for several days. It's very prominent in the sky. And normally in sort of the Roman mind, comets were sinister. They were not, looked as positive. But Octavius sort of realizes, oh, we can play this up. This must be Caesar's murdered soul ascending into the heavens.
Oh my gosh.
He must have been apotheosized, made into a god, right? So he starts printing that on coins.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And he starts putting that on these little glass tokens. So now you have the throne, you have the star, And he also starts referring to himself as the son of a god.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
So
So by making Caesar a god, and then Caesar adopted him, he gets to basically
yeah, he gets to
claim kind of a divine connection.
So were the people basically really just kind of upset with the Senate at that point? I mean, were they already kind of riled up because obviously they killed. Caesar was a popular guy,
yeah,
and they killed him. They murdered him.
yeah.
Like you'd be kind of upset as a population.
100%. And it wasn't only the assassination. It was at this moment in Roman history, you have this sort of dire situation where there's a lot of economic trouble. There's loads of debt. The people are poor. The senators are holding territories. They're holding land all throughout Italy that, is technically state land, but they're, building villas on it.
So they're being super corrupt.
Yeah, and they're having summer parties and sipping, vintage wines.
So Caesar, I guess, was being seen as a kind of champion against like corruption.
Absolutely. And this, like in the last podcast, we talked about Catiline. This is what Catiline was trying to run on this platform of debt cancellation, land redistribution. So this is still existing at this time, and it's what the senators aren't able to rectify.
Okay.
And that's why they come off badly. They think we'll kill Caesar because he's trying to change the status quo, and that'll be that.
Yeah.
But
One thing that I think would be interesting to connect to, like as a tactic, just even based on what you just described with these games, right? Is that, do you guys follow boxing at all?
Not really.
not really.
Okay, so there's been this interesting thing that's been happening in the boxing world recently, where I guess in Saudi Arabia they created like a department of the Saudi government. It's like something the Department of like Games and Entertainment or something. And there's a gentleman there. They call him Turki al-Sheikh, right?
Okay.
And what they've been sort of doing, I guess, because Saudi Arabia is kind of looking forward in terms of what they're trying to do, beyond potentially oil.
Yeah. They also have golf.
And they also have golf.
Live golf.
And so they're trying to become like, a new, almost like a Las Vegas type situation.
Yeah.
So a lot of the major boxing matches recently have been happening there, including both heavyweight championships as of late. One was in May and one was just on December 21st. And what's really interesting about it is that every single time you see anybody talking, so this is happening in Riyadh, they have to thank Turki al-Sheikh. It's almost a joke. Like you have these like sports commentators and we have to thank His Excellency Turki al-Sheikh.
Yeah.
Right. And this whole thing where you're describing Augustus putting on this event, right? So one of the steps to power is like organizing an event.
Yeah.
Something that draws people's eyes to it.
Yeah.
Which in this case, boxing is the modern version of a gladiator sport, right?
Yeah.
And now the Saudi government is trying to connect themselves to this thing. And it's almost a joke. Every single person who's on a TV broadcast during this whole event is like, and we want to thank His Excellency Turki al-Sheikh, which kind of reminds me of this whole Augustus thing.
Yeah, that also reminds me of when Trump's tie with the UFC, right? With Dana White. He shows up at these events and they like treat him like almost like Caesar, like a king.
No, he loves to insert himself in these moments because again, they're great opportunities for political expression. People are happy. They're being subsidized to go to matches and watch fun displays, and politicians are able to capitalize on that.
And then you're building that like neurological association between like the political brand, the name, in this case, the name Caesar, which already had tons of political capital, but you're connecting it now to this sporting event.
Exactly.
Which is, like basically that's why I think most of these companies end up buying like stadiums, right? It's just because they're just trying to do the same thing Augustus is doing here by connecting the two.
Yeah.
The positive associations of screaming and yelling at a sports game.
Well, that's so fascinating because like he did this so many years, like 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And way ahead of his game.
Yeah, and I mean the Romans had always kind of done games, but I think the political moment in Rome had reached such a crisis that now they were able to hold so much more potency and meaning. And when you throw in the random sort of cosmological event like a comet flying across the sky, I mean, nobody could have predicted that. And we know it happened because Chinese astronomers also synchronously kind of recorded this comet.
No way. That's so cool.
It definitely happened. Roman writers wrote about it. The people marveled at it, and Octavius was like, we're gonna use this.
Yeah, connect. It's like, and like we talked about this when we discussed cults, right? Connecting yourself to the supernatural is such a big thing, because if you can connect yourself to some sort of supernatural event, people oftentimes will accept it. They will at the very least, they will see you as lucky.
Yeah,
which is important.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's one of his an early example of the ways in which this kid was able to, manipulate the masses, if you will, but also just navigate the sort of roller coaster that was the post-assassination world. And it's a long story that I don't want to get into the thorny details of, but basically, because there's more interesting things to talk about, I think, with his own sort of branding and his use of words and images. But essentially, he now has to tackle the question of like, okay, how do I navigate this world of Mark Antony on the one hand, and these people who have killed my father, because that's what he starts to call Julius Caesar.
So is he going to parties basically with these people and like hobnobbing with them?
No, he's trying to muster support with the veterans in particular, and because his two sources of power, basically, even though he doesn't have political power yet, are money and troops, right? But the troops are kind of a dicey question because they want him and Antony to be friends. So he has to kind of navigate that relationship. And it's touch and go for a moment, but eventually, I'm skipping over a lot here, but eventually Antony and Octavius form an alliance with this other guy, Lepidus, which is the first triumvirate.
So you said that he had troops, and is that because at this point in time he's Gaius Julius Caesar?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
like in the modern day, that'd be like, I don't know, if you have, he's John F. Kennedy. Let's say John F. Kennedy was assassinated, right? And then he adopted somebody and then gave him the name John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And now you have people who are willing to go to battle and die for you just because you kind of slotted yourself into this world.
Right, but the difference is that, at this point in Roman history, you can do that. You can take a name and automatically have troops that are loyal to that name, to that idea. You go back to the true days of the Roman Republic, and that wasn't the case. You couldn't just take an army because you were a person. But that's the situation you're faced with.
So there's more loyalty to a person than there is to the idea of the Republic.
Exactly. So, anyways, eventually, Octavius, Mark Antony, they become friends. They take care of the assassins at the Battle of Philippi. And at that point, they sort of carve up the Roman world. And Lepidus has one small portion, Octavius has another portion, and Antony takes another portion. And Antony gets what was referred to as the East. So like everything on the Eastern Mediterranean, including Egypt. And it's at that point that Antony goes and starts hanging out with Cleopatra, Caesar's erstwhile mistress. And that does him no favors, because that then, over time, he gets more and more sort of extravagant. He's parading around as Dionysus. He's having these sort of lavish parties. He's having kids by Cleopatra. He's sort of disowning his wife, who happened to be Octavius's sister. So he's doing very un-Roman things down there in Egypt.
So he's getting seduced by the exotic.
Well, yeah, that's sort of the caricature.
So Julius Caesar got with Cleopatra at some point.
He did,
right?
Yeah.
Obviously, he died, and like you said, Mark Antony, he wanted to become basically the next Julius Caesar. So do you think he hooked up with Cleopatra just to, step into his shoes in more ways than one?
Listen, I think Cleopatra, it's hard to tell, right? Because the sources of Roman history are biased, again, written by victors. So you have to kind of read between the lines, but she must have been an incredibly, basically like Octavius's counterpart in female form. She must have been incredibly savvy, incredibly powerful as a ruler, because she was a ruler of Egypt. It was a sovereign country. But she recognized that the Romans were the new big players on the Mediterranean scene. So I think she's playing Antony, and Antony is in a way seduced, but he also recognizes it was kind of like a symbiotic or a mutual kind of beneficial relationship, because Egypt was immensely wealthy, and Cleopatra could lend him money, could lend him troops, whatever he needed, as he went towards potentially the confrontation between himself and his rival Octavius. So it's hard to tell, but I think it definitely helped that Caesar had sort of been there, and he definitely capitalized on that, or thought he was capitalizing on it. But back in Rome, people are seeing this negatively, and Octavius is really stoking that sort of flame. Like, look at Antony. He's doing un-Roman things. He's having kids with this mistress. Like, what's he doing? Does he want to maybe transfer the empire from Rome to Alexandria in Egypt? Like, is he trying to start a new dynasty down there? Like, what's he up to?
He's like tapping into kind of almost like a xenophobia
100%.
against the exotic East.
100%. So that's sort of the pitch that things arrive to after their initial rapprochement and their initial victory over the assassins of Caesar. And things come to a head. Eventually, they do go to full-fledged war, and the sort of conclusion to this very, very abridged version of Octavius's rise to power is he defeats them at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC.
So the tactic here, right, is Augustus is taking his enemy and he's associating himself. He's using PR to associate the enemy with outsiders.
Yeah.
Right? And therefore, basically creating an us versus them mentality in Rome.
Yeah.
And basically, like, this guy just went over there. He's on the other team.
Yeah.
And therefore being able to kind of stoke kind of hatred against Antony.
Yeah. And this was easy to do because the Romans had always had a sort of love-hate relationship with Eastern parts, even Greece. The Romans famously, they conquer Greece, they take it over, but Horace has a line. Horace is one of the poets patronized by Augustus and his buddies. Horace has this famous line that Rome conquered Greece, but Rome conquered Greece with weapons, but Greece eventually conquered Rome with the arts, right? Because the Greeks just were such a big influence on Roman literature and culture, and to an extent, Roman behavior, that it was seen as this sort of ambiguous relationship, because the Greeks, on the one hand, were culturally supreme, but they were also seen as kind of decadent. And that's even more so the case for like the further east you go. So you get to Egypt, and the Egyptians they're also kind of, ever since Alexander sort of conquered Egypt, they're also Greek, but they're even more kind of like decadent. It's
What do you mean by decadent? Like Lots of perfume.
Lots of perfume, lots of Dionysian associations, just different, just other. It was just sort of an easy mark to characters, like that's them, this is us. And us for the Romans was, we are stoic, we're conservative. We believe in the traditions, the mores of the Roman people, and we need to cling to that, because if we don't cling to it, we're going to become super wealthy, and we're going to become super decadent, and we're going to lose our empire because we're going to be too soft to go out and conquer anymore.
Okay.
There's a very popular theme with Roman historians that in the 1st century BC, Rome has kind of like lost enemies. Like once they defeat Carthage, what do we do now? Like, who do we fight? We're just going to become like soft and effeminate, and we're going to lose everything because we have too much money and spare time.
So Augustus is able to basically rally the Romans against Antony, and they defeat Antony and Cleopatra's army.
Yeah.
And then Antony and Cleopatra, they end themselves, right?
Yeah, so there's sort of this battle off of the coast, off of the western coast of Greece, at a place called Actium. It's not a very exciting battle. Basically, Antony and Cleopatra are kind of ill-prepared. They're routed at sea, and they both manage to get on a ship and hightail it back to Egypt. And it's in Egypt, in Alexandria, where they both sort of end their lives, because they realize, it's not going to, the game's over.
They've given up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of Augustus's rise to power, it's like, what are some of the, I guess, the tactics that like we've sort of seen here? So like one of them is this association with spectacle, with putting on events and then having yourself kind of connected to things that people enjoy.
Yeah.
Then there's this aspect of branding, of the fact that like he takes over somebody else's name.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have to build up his own name.
Yeah.
And how crazy is it? Like, this is before like telecommunication or television or anything, that there are men willing to go to battle, to fight in a war for somebody they've never met, just because they like the name.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just kind of curious because, like, you mentioned it was a PR campaign, but they didn't have media back then, right? So how did they get the message across?
They didn't have media like we do. They didn't have videos. They didn't have radio. What they had were coins in the first place, and coins used to be seen by scholars as like, oh man, these must have been the means of propaganda. But if you think about these coins, they're not making it into the hands of the everyday, Jack and Jill. So these little glass tokens that I talked about, those were a more brilliant means of conveying a message, because you could put a sort of image on these. It's kind of hard to describe how they're made, but you could stamp an image on them or blow an image on them. I don't know how.
So it's like a cheap flyer, basically?
It's a cheap flyer, and it's very easy to produce. It's cheap, and so you distribute that among the people, and it gets your message across. So you have that. You have inscriptions. There's a statistic about inscriptions sort of before and after the time of Augustus. Before Augustus, there's maybe, I don't know if this is the exact figure, but it's something on the order of like 50,000 maybe that archaeologists have uncovered. After him, there's about 300 to 500,000. So exponentially, these things start to grow, because politicians are using inscriptions. So anytime they set up a monument, anytime they mark a territory, they're putting an inscription,
make sure it's seen,
that people can read. Now, you have to be literate for that to be useful, but you also have things like plays, right? So we talked a little bit about the poets. One of the brilliant things Octavius does is he patronizes poets like Horace and Virgil, among others. And now they start writing poems that sort of prop up the regime, so to speak. They praise Octavius and his deeds, and these are read aloud because it's a very oral culture. So you didn't even have to read to get the message from literature. And also, Virgil's poems, for example, we know that some of them were produced as plays, at these various games and festivals.
So would it be accurate to like say that by collecting these poets, the poets at that point in time were almost kind of the same level as maybe our film directors today?
Yeah.
It's like collecting your Spielbergs and Chris Nolans and all these people and then having them make movies that make you look awesome.
100%, because also the system of writing at this point is purely patronage. So like it's crazy to think about, but as someone who writes, but Virgil and Horace, for example, they're given whole villas, not just a little country house. They're given like villas by Augustus and by his right-hand man Maecenas, because that's how much money they had. So they're given this gift, go write, but also write something that's going to reflect well on us.
So what are they writing?
Well,
That's like it's giving. What are they writing to get a villa? How do I get a villa?
this is a good question. I mean, Horace is kind of this jovial poet. He's kind of writing these lyric poems that are addressed to different powerful Romans. A lot of them are associated with the Emperor Augustus. And he never writes what I would imagine every ruler would want a poet that they're paying to write. He never writes an epic. He keeps sort of refusing in very graceful but firm ways, because that's not Horace's style. So he's writing kind of lighter verse that is incredibly innovative. So even if it's not, full on praising Augustus, it's got his name attached to it. It's advancing Roman art and culture. So that's a win.
So
right?
Horace is like the pop songwriter?
Kind of like the pop songwriter, yeah. And he just loves to write about, going to his villas and drinking wine and carpe diem. That's his tagline. That's his phrase. So that's kind of his style. Virgil, on the other hand, is a graver poet. He's more serious, and he's much more the type that would write an epic, which eventually he does. And this is really interesting because one of the things that had been sort of haunting, maybe that's too strong a word, but it's sort of associated with Augustus in this time when he's doing the battles in Philippi and at Actium. He has this habit of falling ill right before every battle, right? He was sort of a delicate constitution. So before these major battles, he kind of gets stomach aches, and his doctors say, well, maybe you should sit this one out. And so he ends up sitting them out, or he like goes and hides in bushes, and it's not heroic at all.
So was he actually just running from battles?
It seems like it.
Because it's happened multiple times.
Now, it did happen multiple times, so it doesn't look good for him. There were battles in which he did fight, and his troops, hail him as imperator, which is a very big thing in a Roman military situation. But he does seem to be falling ill right before crucial battles. So Virgil eventually comes to write this poem called the Aeneid, which is sort of an epic poem, not expressly about Augustus. It's actually about the founding of the Roman people. So it tells the story of Aeneas, who was a Trojan, who ends up fleeing Troy and coming to Italy and founding the Roman race, right? Now, within that story, Virgil very creatively finds a way to insert Augustus into the poem. So there's this one famous example in book 8 of the Aeneid, where sort of like in the Iliad, when Hephaestus makes the shield for Achilles, and you get this sort of description of what the shield looks like. What are these images on the shield? You get that in book 8, only this time the shield is being made for Aeneas. But what are the images that Virgil describes on the shield? The images look forward to the contemporary moment in Roman history. So they portray Augustus, for example, at the Battle of Philippi. And where is he? not the Battle of Philippi, the Battle of Actium. And where is he? He's not sick in his tent or hiding in a shrub. He's at the front of the ship. He's leading the charge against Antony and Cleopatra. He's driving them back to Egypt. He's portrayed as what he eventually becomes called, right? The savior of the country.
Do we have like a modern person we can think of who did something very cowardly and then try to like rewrite it after the fact? I'm trying to think of something.
Well,
I can't think of anybody.
Yeah,
there's several politicians, right? Think of George Bush, right? He entered the naval guard rather than the army.
Oh, yeah.
There's draft dodgers like. What was Trump doing during?
Oh yeah,
I don't know. He probably
no.
got
He had what is it? Something with his feet. He had like the spurs.
Yeah.
He got out of Vietnam for spurs.
Yeah. So there's always always something.
Right, but then somebody going back afterwards and trying to retell the story.
Yeah.
In a way that makes them.
Yeah. It might be more heroic in his memoirs whenever he comes to or has a ghostwriter write them.
Yeah, I mean, I love the imagery though that they used back then.
Yeah,
and it has so many parallels. Like I think about American history, right? When I think about like iconic images, I think of like George Washington.
Yeah.
On the crossing the Delaware.
on the Delaware.
Who's famous for running
painting.
away from battles?
Was he?
Yeah.
Oh man.
Was he?
Yeah. So I mean, that's one of the funny things about George Washington. He's never won a battle.
Well, I didn't know that. But how would I know?
But
right?
what George Washington was incredible at, during the Revolutionary War, was that I think they called him the Fox.
Yeah.
Because the British were trying to pin him down to finally defeat him, but he was always able to escape. And he was famous for having a spy network.
Oh.
Right.
They did an entire show on like AMC or History Channel about it, about the spy network, the Culpeper Ring, which are basically spies who are sneaking into New York. New York was under control of the British, and then like getting them to like give up information about the British troop movements.
Wow.
And then George Washington was able to
See, I didn't know
not
that.
get defeated.
I didn't know
either.
that.
Listen, there's many paths to victory, and I think Octavius Augustus's path was, I'm just gonna have my buddy do the fighting. So he had one of his childhood friends, this guy Agrippa, become sort of his general, his lieutenant. And Agrippa's the one that is really the military genius. He fights all these battles. He makes all the preparations. So that's an aspect, I think, of this character that's really interesting, is that, it's not just him. He's good at selecting people to manage parts of, being the leader of Rome in ways that maybe he was deficient, right? So
I think that's actually a really brilliant tactic to kind of think about, where a lot of times as we go through the world, we all kind of want to get credit for ourselves, right? But one of the most effective ways to potentially move through the world, right, is if you can find the people who can do things better than you.
yeah,
But then you kind of hitch yourselves together, but under one brand,
yeah,
like one name, whatever it is. So imagine, like, I don't know, maybe you're like a film director or something, right? But you're maybe not that good of a film director, but you look good as a film director, right? And then you get other people who are willing to like ghostwrite for you, maybe.
Right.
Or like a lot of songwriters have that. You have pop singers, right, who have ghostwriters, and the pop singers are claiming to have writing credit, but they're not the ones actually doing it. Mm-hmm. But then both the ghostwriter and the face benefit and go a lot farther than if they didn't work together.
Yeah.
Because
and this was a problem, I think, with the old Roman system, is that it was very conservative and snobbish, right? So if there was a person who would have been a good, military tactician or, a good person to have on your staff, but they weren't from, one of the old guard families, that person lost out, and you lost out because you didn't have that talent. So one of the things that Caesar was good at, and one of the things that Augustus was good at, is just picking the right people, regardless of who they were, where they came from, so long as they had the talent that you needed. That's all they cared about. So
Can we talk a little bit about the difference between how Julius Caesar kind of ran his empire, I guess, or his dictatorship versus Augustus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe we can talk about names too in addressing this question, because Caesar, I think, had a lot of great qualities and talents. He was a brilliant general. He was a brilliant rhetorician, and he set about to try and solve this problem that had been plaguing the Roman Republic for probably hundreds of years, which was you started to have this dynamic where the empire needed to adapt to the economic realities of Italy, right? So what were you going to do with all of these urban plebs, the sort of average Joe in Rome? There was thousands of them, and they needed constant attention. They were in constant danger of causing disruptions. So one of the ideas was canceling debts and making things a little bit easier for various people. The land question, so like redistributing land so that people could have farms and small houses instead of these senators sort of hoarding all of the nice estates. So he's starting to try to solve that problem, and he's giving large amounts of money to these people in Rome. He's thinking about carving up Italy in ways that would sort of take land away from wealthy senators and maybe give them to sort of mid-level sort of.
So he's like a Bernie Sanders.
Kind of like a Bernie Sanders, yeah.
Very
It's
popular.
like mid sort of middle class Romans, and it's all going very well, except Caesar at the same time is starting to style himself as he's really rubbing it in the face of the senators how much better he is than all of them, and he's making moves to sort of extend his powers. So at a certain point, he becomes dictator, which was an official sort of role that you could play as a Roman statesman. Whenever the state was in crisis, you'd appoint a dictator, but it was time bound. So you'd be dictator maybe for 9 months, and then you'd relinquish that power. And the true Roman ideal was that you relinquish the power, you go back to your farm, right? That's kind of what the Romans wanted. Caesar doesn't do that. He keeps extending, and then finally he has the Senate decree that he is dictator for life. And that's right at the moment where they have enough and they assassinate him. So I think that's Caesar's real sort of Achilles heel is that his grandeur gets in the way of things. And that's where Octavius is smarter, right? He sees what happens to Caesar when he's 18, and I think he very quickly realized upon coming back to Rome that he had to do things differently. He knew what the problems were. He knew how Caesar addressed it was probably the right way, but the style that Caesar used was not the right way. So he starts doing things differently, and one of the ways that he does things differently is I think a very important way is the names that he uses. So when he's born in 63, right, he's Gaius Octavius, which is sort of the traditional name. Gaius was the name of his father, so he becomes Gaius. Octavius is the name of his family, so he's Gaius Octavius. At the adoption, he calls himself Julius Caesar, right? He takes Caesar's name. But technically his name should have been Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. So Octavius changes to Octavianus to sort of signal his adoption. But he doesn't ever call himself that. Others call him that, and others also call him names that are not nice also. So like Antony keeps referring to him as that boy, Istep puer. So they're kind of pejorative names. They're kind of undermining him or underestimating him, right, at this moment. But then he starts to accrue other names. So when that comet happens, I mentioned, he becomes Divi Filius. He becomes son of a god, right? So he starts to play with that, and then eventually he does win some battles. And so he drops the name Gaius and he takes the name Imperator. That becomes his first name, which is kind of an arrogant thing. That's kind of in the style of Caesar, but it was palatable to the people, and it was palatable to even the more conservative factions, because that was a respectable sort of like Imperator. That was like, okay, that's something that we do. You know, that's what you're hailed.
Yeah. And that meant like commander in chief, right? Something like that.
Something like that, yeah. So that becomes his first name. So at this point, he's Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, which is a mouthful, but it doesn't stop there, because later on, after he finally defeats Antony, and he comes back to Rome, and he's now in this situation where, okay, he's definitely the de facto ruler, but how do you brand that, you know, so you don't get assassinated like Caesar? What he figures out is he can maintain his power, but he can also maintain this sort of facade of the old republic. He can use names and words that make it look like the republic is still the republic, even though it isn't, because he's basically at this point the emperor. So what he does in the Senate is, instead of calling himself like dictator for life like Caesar did, or calling himself king, he calls himself the princeps, which means something like the first gentleman, or literally the first head. He calls himself princeps senatus, which means that he's the presider, but the Senate is still the Senate. It's still an entity, and he's the big head honcho, right? So it's more palatable than the names that Caesar was using for himself. And then a year after that, so that's in 28 BC, in 27 BC, he comes up with his official title, which I imagine he probably huddled around with all of his buddies, and he kind of workshopped, because he really does think about this.
Okay,
he really
like a marketing department working on his title.
100%. He really does think long and hard about what he should call himself, because he needed a name to match the dignity and authority that he had, but at the same time, a name that wouldn't piss off senators and people who were envious of how much power he had accumulated. So he comes up with this name, which is a brilliant name. If you think about Roman history and Roman associations, he calls himself Augustus, which is a name that etymologically is tied to a lot of institutions that the Romans cared about, like augury, but it's also tied to the means by which old Romans used to rule, which is this idea of auctoritas, which is where we get our word authority from, which is a kind of soft power. It's not tied to any kind of like violence or political power. It's literally your influence. You know, you had become such a senior statesman that your mere word, even if you didn't have the head office of the consulship or any of the other offices, you were just a senator who had proved his sort of stature. Your mere word would carry weight. And that was the ideal of the Senate, is to rule by authority, to give counsel.
It's almost like leading by example.
Yes.
Or like being a wise man.
Exactly.
It's very interesting, like as you're describing this whole like this progression of him going from his first name to taking on Julius Caesar's name, and then moving on to this August thing. It really reminds me of, there's that line in Sun Tzu where
the art of war.
Art of war, right? Appear strong when you are weak, and then appear weak when you are strong.
Yeah.
And so in the beginning, like Augustus is like, he's kind of a weakling. He's a sickly 18-year-old kid with no power.
Yeah.
So he's taking on names like Imperator.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But then later on, once he's actually in control, he's actually trying to downplay.
Yeah, it's a very classy move, I think, and it's very smart labeling, because it doesn't throw his actual power, because his actual power was, yes, it was this sort of influence, but it was money and troops. When you really boil it down, it was money and troops that was keeping him in this position. But he casts it in a different light.
So did he just have like troops hanging out outside of Rome, or like how did that work?
Well, he had he had a guard, right? So he had his own personal guard, but he also, this is the key thing that he does. So when he defeats Antony and Cleopatra, he eventually subdues Egypt, and he keeps Egypt as his own personal province. That's his territory. No Roman senator could even enter Egypt without consent from Augustus, because Egypt was a sort of breadbasket. That was the means by which Romans fed the Italian peninsula, and it was also immensely wealthy. So he didn't want any other senator going down there, stirring up the people and possibly causing a sort of revolution. So he protects that. So he has, again, just immense wealth and power from these things. So he calls himself Augustus, but he gets one more name in 2 BC, which is a name that the Senate awards him, doubtless with his consent, called Pater Patriae, which is a very important name because it means father, literally father of the country or savior of the country. It's a designation that Cicero got when he defeats or when he takes care of the Catilinarian conspiracy. They hail him as the savior of the country. They call him Pater Patriae. But more importantly, way back at the beginning of Roman history, in what was it, like the 8th century or whatever, Romulus, the very first sort of ruler of Rome, that was his title. It was Pater Patriae. So it's this kind of full circle moment for Augustus with this name. It's at once a very traditional name, but it's also a name that was used by effectively the first king of Rome, because Romulus was he was a king. So it's very interesting.
Symbols matter.
The valences.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good point. He said, like you said, symbols do matter, especially back in these days. Again, when you didn't have mass communication, you had to have this symbolism that can very simply, through whether like tokens or coins or like inscriptions,
simple names,
titles themselves, just by referring somebody as a certain title, communicate so much of that message. That PR campaign.
Meanwhile, Antony down in Egypt, before he was taken care of with Cleopatra, he's calling his kids names like Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Like these are very kind of like exotic,
like godlike names.
Yeah, to Roman ears, these are very exotic. These are un-Roman names. So
interesting.
Yeah, it'd be like naming your kid today Zeus and Thor or something.
Exactly. So
no, it's interesting because again, like symbols matter, right? And what a lot of times what ends up happening is that you start with something complex, right? But it's hard. Like he clearly probably had a marketing department, right? To get things down to a very, very simple idea, to the point where like whenever you see the Apple logo on a computer, right? They don't even have to say Apple anymore. It's just the symbol is so ingrained in our minds.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a cool thing where or Tesla, like with time you develop something where you right away, you have this thing and it builds immediate associations,
recognition,
and like the memories start flooding in right away just by seeing this symbol.
Feelings, emotions, like call into the past. You have such a connection. Yeah. But the fact that again he was able to do this so effectively.
Well, he develops his own little symbol, which is the Capricorn. Which is
I'm a Capricorn.
You're a Capricorn. It's Capricorn season. People love astrology. So that's a quick thing we could talk about, and it's very interesting because he was not born during Capricorn season. He was born in September, at least according to our sources. So he was born in late September, right around the equinox in 63 BC. But he takes on this association of the Capricorn. Now, there's theories about why this might have been the case. I think the most convincing one is that that was his symbol at his conception. Because he would have been conceived around December, right?
Okay.
According to sort of Roman ideas of conception. So he leads with that, and this is yet another example of how important symbols were to him, because the Capricorn I think that one of the biggest associations it had for him was this idea of fortuna, luck.
Okay.
You know, the sort of bounty and luck that came with his name. He runs with that, and it also has this idea of new beginnings, right? Because Capricorn, right now, we just had the winter solstice, and that's the moment when the year starts to return to spring. The light grows longer, and so you have this new beginning that happens. So he associates himself very strongly with this. He's putting it on coins. He's putting it on these little glass tokens.
Such a weird choice. A sea goat.
It is a very.
I mean, I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like you would jump for like the the Cancer crab or like the lion or something
Or like, you
more
know,
badass.
Aries, maybe. Like,
Why sea
like a
goat?
ram.
I mean, I'm a proud Capricorn, but sea goat.
Again, I think it's this association of just luck and that the big one is new beginnings, because this ends up, you know, once he's firmly in power, he creates this whole complex on this floodplain right outside of Rome called the Campus Martius. That's where he sets up his mausoleum, and it's this gigantic building that's not only could house him upon his death, but all of his dynastic successors, because he's thinking in these terms already at this point. So he constructs this thing, and right alongside it, he constructs an altar of peace, which is sort of like, think of like the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, it's not that big, but it's kind of that sort of like a temple that you walk into. And outside of it are all these sort of relief sculptures that are depicting ideas of bounty, ideas of peace, ideas of there are scenes from Roman history. So he's got that there. But the big thing that he has is this obelisk, which he brings from Egypt, and he sets up right there in the Campus Martius. And at the top of it is this little ball with another little obelisk on it. And at the base of it is this sort of, you know, think of the obelisk like this, and you have at the base this thing called, it's called a gnomon, which has these little notches in it that every day at noon, when the sun reaches the zenith, you know, and it casts its shadow, these little notches allow observers to sort of follow the shadow through the courses of the year. So you get one little marker for the spring equinox, you get another one for the autumnal equinox and the solstices, and the very last one is the winter solstice. So right about now. So, and that's Capricorn, right? So you can imagine the shadow at noon at the winter solstice going all the way up to that top notch. And it symbolizes, again, sort of the returning of the light, the returning of the year. And the last fact about this is every day at sundown, especially towards the autumnal equinox, which is his birthday, right? So around September 22nd, 23rd, the shadow at sundown points right to the altar of peace. So at his birthday, it sort of symbolizes his sort of bringing of peace to the Roman people. So it's an incredible structure that he sets up in terms of his name, in terms of his legacy, in terms of his dynastic successors. And it's very simple. It's very elegant.
I never really thought about this before. I guess Augustus put so much emphasis on this winter solstice thing, right? But again, nobody's really sure when Jesus Christ was born, but they decided that his birthday was going to be the winter solstice.
Yep.
And that's a few hundred years down the line, probably. But that is also an interesting choice. Like, what is so magical about this time, about the time of Capricorns?
Yeah. It is very powerful, I think, for these reasons. I mean, you think about it in terms of like, why do we celebrate New Year's when we do, right? It would probably make more sense to celebrate it in spring. That's when like things are blooming, it's nice, the weather's, you can go outside. But I think it's this idea of that shift in the year that you get astrologically, you know,
The rebirth.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, very cool. Again, the importance of symbolism that carries meaning back then was probably more important to them than it is now, because again, they didn't have that level of mass communication. They didn't have the internet. They had to rely on these monuments even
Yeah.
to carry that message. But it's such an effective form of communication if you think about it. Yeah.
And these were also beautiful
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
right? These were beautiful things to walk around. There's this idea that, Augustus, found Rome brick and he made it marble. He adorns the city. And while he's adorning it, he's also reminding people like, hey, I'm the one who did this.
Did Augustus co-opt any other like symbols or images? Because I think that's always kind of an interesting thing when you have people like, movie stars, right? They tap into things that came before and they kind of like try to reference it again.
Yeah. He associates himself with Apollo. I mean, but that's not really co-opting. That's just sort of a choice that he...
That's just like a choice he makes.
Yeah. I can't think of any outright things that he co-opts. But I'm sure there are.
Yeah.
Because this was what he was all about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are some, let's go through some of the I guess the things that we discovered today, tactic wise. Because again, we learn a lot from stories, and brains also think in stories. So a lot of the ways we make sense of the world is through stories. So whether we're learning about ancient Rome or you're learning about some mythology someplace, right? It is one of the ways we process the world. So,
I mean, I can tell you just from just hearing the story, like what I've learned.
okay.
Right? Because Augustus sounds like he's the ultimate personal brand, right? Where he kind of was able to read the room, the situation, society. He was the one who knew how to give what the people wanted.
Yeah.
And not only by his actions, but by his branding that, again, didn't want to offend anybody.
Yeah.
Or didn't want to make enemies with the wrong people. But he knew how to skirt around that just by the messaging. And that is like, so it's such a simple thing, but he was so smart.
He really was. And also enigmatic, though, because I think his branding, his imaging was so effective once he does attain power. You kind of are left with two versions, right? The boy who has to fight his way through Mark Antony and the senators, he was quite ruthless. He kills a lot of people, getting to where he got. So you have that version, and then you have this sort of sanitized version of the father, the savior of the country. And I think partly it's through lack of sources that we have these two conflicting images, but also I think in a large part it's just he was so effective once he did become the sole ruler that we automatically think of him in this way.
Yeah, and what kind of Darren is saying kind of reminds me of you said a phrase earlier that he was essentially doing the same thing Caesar was doing, but he did it in a different style.
Yeah,
and the style mattered.
yeah.
So how you frame a message.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, this ties into ancient rhetoric too. It's everything boils down to rhetoric, like knowing your audience and knowing what messaging to deliver if you want A, B, or C outcome, right? And I don't think Caesar quite got it. As brilliant as he was as a speaker and as a politician, he kind of, the narrative gets away from him, right? He starts to really like think of himself in terms of something that was not palatable to Roman minds. And Augustus was better, I guess, in this regard.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that kind of wraps up our podcast. Thank you, Dr. Ian Silva, for this amazing kind of walk through history, I guess. And again, it's fascinating. Just
Always a
fascinating.
pleasure.
The parallels are just so true even today. Just hearing about these ancient stories, which again, like I couldn't just help myself just thinking about, oh my God, this just happened this past political year. Like these parallels, like these guys that are the right way, the wrong way, how you message things, how you brand things, how you communicate, how you talk to people. It's so important these days. And I think it's a great message kind of.
Yeah. History
learn.
might not repeat itself, but it sure rhymes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Comes
Mark
close.
Twain.
Okay, well, anyways, I'm Darren. Thank you for joining us on our podcast for Manipulation Games, Psychology, and Marketing. You can find us on YouTube. We have a lot of great videos, and you can learn about all aspects of psychology and marketing and even history. And so thank you for joining us. I'm Darren again with our marketing genius, Gene, and Dr. Ian Silva. Thank you for listening. Until
Cheers,
next
guys.
time. Bye.